Try once again.
No,
Yeah.
it's yeah. Hello, everybody. So, welcome to season 2 of our lecture series, Citing Vulnerability, being hosted by the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies at the Department of English, the University of Hyderabad. In this round, we have lectures on posthumanism, on aging and care and waste and vulnerability, several aspects of it, which will be covered in lectures starting today all the way till the end of March. We're very grateful for those people who have joined in during our first season and the responses we have received from them in terms of feedback. Those who have viewed our online educational resources, which are made principally of these talks. And we are happy that the people whom we invite are so willing and obliging to join us despite their schedules. As those of you who are aware of this and those who are not, please bear with me. The UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies is a chair which came to us in 22, initiated and inaugurated on the 7th of November 22. And the mandate as prescribed by the UNESCO document is that we cover different kinds of vulnerability, aging, species loss and extinction, uh, gender, poverty, and also cultural heritage and its vulnerabilities. We have done a fair amount of work in these areas, including online courses, faculty development programs in collaboration with NIT Trichy, conferences and workshops all over the place, and of course, lectures and publications. For those of you who are rolling up for the first time, all the talks, maybe except one or two, are available on the UNESCO Chair's website as open educational resource. It's part of the Chair's commitment to developing OERs so that people can access educational materials without payment and paywalls and things like that. And we are very grateful also to our resource persons and speakers who have happily agreed to allowing us to both record and put it up for people to read, access, and make notes from. So welcome all of you, and I will hand this over to the faculty fellow in vulnerability studies, part of the chair team, and that is Professor Anna Kurian, my colleague in the Department of English and French. Over to you, Anna.
Thank you, Pramod. And it is my job today, because our research associate is on a small break. So it's my job today to welcome and introduce Professor Callus to the audience here. Gives me a lot of pleasure to have Professor Callus at this meeting, because also we met online over email initially when he was the examiner for one of our students. And it is a real pleasure, sir, to meet you today. Professor Callus, for those of you who don't know, works in English Studies at the Faculty of Arts at the University of Malta. His research interests include contemporary fiction, literary criticism and theory, posthumanism, and the futures of literature. He has an extensive CV. I will try and summarize it as much as possible and highlight what to me are points of interest. So he is the founding co-editor with James Corby, a colleague of his, of the journal Countertext, which is a journal for the study of the post-literary, and it was launched in 2015. He is also, one of his strong interests being posthumanism, he is, along with Stefan Herbechter, the co-editor of the Critical Posthumanism's book series published by Brill, also co-editor of the Critical Posthumanism Network. He has co-edited with colleagues and friends several books, of which I would like to mention just two. One, because of the pun in the name, Cyborgs, Cyborg Hairs, Memories of Posthumanism in the work of Jorge Luis Borges, and Posthumanist Shakespeare's. He works, as I said, in contemporary narrative, etc., and his work on post-structuralist literary theory, comparative literature, and contemporary narrative has appeared in journals such as Angela Key, Arcadia, Electronic Book Review, Forum for Modern Language Studies, Parallax, Countertext, and Word and Text. He teaches courses which include, interestingly, both creative writing as well as literary studies, looking at American and English British narratives and narratology, but also, interestingly, Hamlet. I think with just this brief introduction, we will move on. And once again, Professor Callus, welcome very warmly indeed from all of us here, the audience, for your talk today.
Thank you very much, Anna. Thank you, Pramod. It's wonderful to be with you today. I'm very thankful for the honor of the invitation. I'm glad to be with you. I'm going to speak today about. I guess you can see my screen and the presentation. So the title of my talk is Vulnerability in Extremis, Reflections on Jean-Baptiste François Xavier Cousin de Grimville's The Last Man. I shall be referring to the author by the name of just the word Grimville. I have 4 broad sections. I shall start with an introduction introducing the theme of vulnerability and crisis, moving on to the literature of vulnerability and crisis, some general considerations in the frame of post-humanism, and then I'll get to Ahead of Its Time, Grimville's The Last Man, finishing, hopefully not too ominously with a conclusion called The Worst. So, among the most curious aspects of vulnerability, a situation, state of mind, propensity, is the character of its temporalities and timescapes. Vulnerability is all about our proneness to what might conceivably turn into worse or worst. It is therefore braced, perhaps resigned to, certainly apprehensive about what could happen next. Vulnerability must think about whether it must soon summon resilience and resolve, but it could also quail before what is impending, fearing that the reaction will rather be one of fragility or even fecklessness. The time of vulnerability can be short, down to a few seconds, as in a skid. Or it can go on significantly longer, especially in circumstances where the intractabilities are systemic, as with autoimmunity or the uncertain midst of Cold Wars and their logic of deterrence, which keeps the unthinkable hovering. Vulnerability, in other words, is about a time potentially of dread. This is related and yet different to the time of crisis. Crisis, surely, is what happens after a vulnerability tips over into what had been dreaded. Crisis breaks time. It is eruptive. It violently institutes a before and an after, each of which finds their definition in the break when, where vulnerability became crisis. Of course, that break does not mean that things cannot deteriorate further. The time of crisis can itself be a time of vulnerability, precipitating heightened propensities to ruder shocks and more abject situations. Lear's words capture that stricken reality. He cries, when sorrows come, they come not in single spies, but in battalions. Or in the words of the song by the Chancers, a telling name in this context, things can only get worse. There is another song, there always is, proclaiming that things can only get better in a more hopeful stance. And here again, the name of the band, in this case, the name of the exponent, in this case, the Reem, is telling, though differently so, and there will be more to say about the dreamlike and the visionary soon. Nor can it be overlooked that vulnerability is itself crisis. The two interrelate, often to the point of indistinguishability, such that the latter may mark itself from the former only into apprehending of a turn to degeneration or disintegration that can have its own modalities of time, ranging from gradualist to sudden catastrophe. Until or while that happens, a sense of vulnerability can be disabling, paralyzing. If conversely one gamely soldiers on, hoping for the best, as one does and as the world does, the sense of Damoclean contingency is not easily dispelled. Nor would disaster feel like the caprice of fate, because vulnerability, if it knows itself, has prescience, from which come foreboding and dark imaginings. The prescience does not mean that vulnerability will not delude itself, that crisis can be kept at bay. What is the worst that could happen? We tell ourselves. The rhetoric behind this question, which should not be classed as a rhetorical question, is curious. Evidently, it is not asked in conjuration of the inconceivable worst. Rather, it is asked through a psychology of rationalizing, readying self-preservation. In this dynamic, the worst that could happen is anticipated, visualized, rehearsed, in an effort or at accommodation to and of what is marginally or substantially more bearable. This psychology performs itself even while knowing that the worst could, indeed by its nature will, still surprise if it happens after all. Literature, of course, has a sublimating role in this pre-imagining and this prescribing. So does religion before it. The overriding examples may be the Book of Job and the Book of Revelation, each of which is eminently readable in the key, a maximalist key, in their case, of the literature of vulnerability and crisis. This talk will stay this side of that maximalism in its choice of case study, though what it discusses is extreme enough. Indeed, the text it concerns itself with is a tale of what it might be like to be most alone while being in extremis. In such complete crisis, is it possible to still be vulnerable, or has the worst already happened? Might some minimal space for consolation, hope, or redemption be discoverable there? These questions and scenarios are discussed in the context of a reading of The Last Man by Jean-Baptiste François Xavier Cousin de Granville, first published posthumously in 1805 as Le Dernier Homme, in striking, if under-commented, precedence to identically titled words by, among others, Mary Shelley and Maurice Blanchot. The reading is informed in the conclusion by perspectives referencing the work of Jacques Derrida, whose commentaries on horizons and on the worst are salient to this context. Before that direction, however, some general remarks on the literature of vulnerability and crisis will help to usefully frame and characterize the context. They proceed in conjunction with reference to posthumanism, the contemporary paradigm that is more than ordinarily bound up with intimations of vulnerability and crisis, but also with opportunity and reinvention. So I come to my second section, literature of vulnerability and crisis. Hopefully it will not seem precious to say that all literature, certainly all narrative, is about vulnerability and crisis. Outside those literary experiments that probe the possibilities of storyless novels or characterless tales or narratives without locus, there will be action and decision. And the tendency is that neither of the two will be emerging from lifeless. This, incidentally, is why the art of the vignette, in whatever form or medium, is striking. It captures, it arrests a moment that is more amenable to the depiction of an irenic state than most other art. Consider a different example. Even Lewis Carroll's Alice experienced vulnerability and crisis. Indeed, children's literature is as much about the exploration of those states, if not always about their overcoming, as any other writing. The reference to Alice in Wonderland introduces a motif that will be vital, as will be shown, to Graham V's The Last Man. It is the motif of dream or vision. Meanwhile, looming large over the literature of vulnerability is the spectre of tragedy, in the sense of both event and form or mode. Something ought to be said here about it in the context of posthumanism, too. Tragedy has traditionally been figured in terms of individual downfall, though with distinct implications for the polis, the precarities of which may have been rendered more vulnerable still as a result of the events witnessed. Conversely, the crisis may, as a result of the catastrophe, turn. There may be some scope for renewal, for commune, if not individual, and if not, the consequences must be met. Greek tragedy understands, certainly in Sophocles' Theban plays and Aeschylus's The Oresteia, how individual vulnerabilities can precipitate tragic cycles across generations and territories, the crisis becoming ever aggravated and self-perpetuating, expansive and enveloping. The thought that, quote, sometimes what's terrible can work to bring about what's good, unquote, lingers, whether delusively or otherwise, in measure of humanizing hope. Who knew in the midst of those cycles that vengeful furies can, despite everything, become gracious Eumenides? The quote, of course, is from the Eumenides. Yet consuming though these tragedies are, in places like Elsinore too, they remain, dare one say it, local. Posthuman tragedy intrudes on this tradition to redefine the sense of epical vulnerability and crisis and its representability. The scale and consequentiality envisaged are altogether different and starker. The stakes are higher. Potentially, it is the human itself that is beset. And of course, the non-human, too, finds itself entirely vulnerable, or worse, in a precarity that in a time of climate change and nuclear proliferation, which has us ask, is this the worst yet? No. In a time where all of that is anthropogenic and potentially all-consuming. For this, too, there is a prefiguring literature. Indeed, for this too, there is a figuring literature, indeed a prefiguring literature. It is a literature that allows a conceiving not only of posthuman tragedy, but also of what might be thought of as the posthuman sublime. This is where Graham V's The Last Man comes in. Outside depictions of the apocalypse and the last judgments in theological and religious writings, it is an text for the post-apocalyptic imaginary. Before contextualizing Graham V's text and discussing it, I'd like to pause just a little longer on the idea of posthuman tragedy and the idea of the posthuman sublime. There are different ways in which posthuman tragedy can be figured in the imagination or precipitated in the real. For instance, there is the post-Aristotelian rhetorical key, where humans, or indeed humanity itself, finds comeuppance as an outcome of overreaching questing, or as or the all too unrhetorical Holocene or sixth extinction visited upon non-human life by human agency, or the extinction of the human itself in scenarios that are not hard to conceive and that are, in fact, amply potentiated. In all of these, there are vulnerabilities at play, and there is a sense of ultimacy that comes to the vulnerabilities in question. Vulnerabilities of non-human life and matter and earth, vulnerabilities of the human, the core. This is vulnerability in extremis. It involves sundry totalities being on the cusp of the irreversible. Arguably, the post-human condition coincides with, is definable in terms of this post-human vulnerability to post-human tragedy. Permacrisis, in this light, goes beyond the tensions and conflicts dominating 24-hour news cycles. It is rather about a vulnerability that articulates itself to itself in the intimation that there is nothing hyperbolic in observing the doomsday clock being synchronized to extreme time. It is also about a quaint reassurance that the hour is vulnerable, not critical, that we are all still this side of the crisis, in suspension or abeyance of worse, of worst. It is not a consolation to recognize that the vulnerability that profiles itself here and what it could tip into draws a form of post-human sublime. The Burkean or Kantian criteriology for the sublime, envisaging awe and fear, astonishment and terribilité in the prospect's glimpsed, is satisfied. The prospect's glimpsed. In the end, prospect of the end is what this will have been about, the tense play of tenses. It is curious how much the discourse around vulnerability, indeed around the post-human, is about what is prospective, indeed what could be dreadfully imminent, even imminently immanent. Yet it remains speculative, a wager, on the possibility of continuing to use the subjunctive and the future tense in the time and temporality of the vulnerable, not the present simple and the present continuous in the time and temporality of the crisis, and not any of the past tenses, which, while they could mean that the crisis is over, could also prime new vulnerability to further, doubtless worse, crises. Because crises, once precipitated, thus tend to come in cycles. We shall always have been vulnerable again. For this reason, vulnerability, if it articulates itself as such and in broader awareness, may want to be monetary, aversive, but will know, Cassandra-like, that it may not avail. Of course, it could be countered that everything that has just been said is qualifiable, especially because it will have come across as dramatic or even melodramatic. Not that vulnerability and crisis do not tend in that direction, to be fair. It is good, in fact, that the tradition of critical posthumanism is well placed to problematize the perspectives advanced so far. To mention just one example, Stefan Herbrechter's reflections on posthuman tragedy would, in a longer space, need to be brought to bear on what has been discussed. It is also a feature of critical posthumanism that it will explore an issue or set of issues through close reading of their genealogies in the imaginary, as well as through close reading of a text or practice and moments therein that emerge as emblematic and revealing. It is with such moves and moments in view that Granville's The Last Man is relevant to a consideration of the relation between vulnerability and crisis. And I come to my third section called Of Its Time or ahead of its time. Grenville's The Last Man. Discussion of Grenville's The Last Man depends on contextualization of its author, text, narrative, and time. This will here be kept to the minimum necessary in view of the time available, but also because that work has been done comprehensively by, among others, I.F. Clarke and M. Clarke in their introduction to their introduction to their 2002 English translation of the prose poem, because that is what The Last Man is, and by Morton Paley, the series of studies around the last man trope in literature. The repeated suggestion across the literary historical scholarship is that Grenville's text is the first narrativization of the idea of the last man, of the figure of the last man. Of course, the idea of primacy is always vulnerable to the discovery of prior influence. We know, too, that the idea of the end of the world is immemorial, evidenced in religious writing and thought, and serially prophesied across cultures. In the iconography of the West, it is regularly represented in art and sculpture and in architectural representation, or in artifacts like the 14th century 140-meter-long series of apocalypse tapestries commissioned by Louis I, Duke of Anjou, preserved since 1480 in Angers Cathedral. The more interesting question, however, is how and why the idea would yield the trope and figure of the last man, for a long time now a staple of speculative fiction, film, television, and digital games. So the question would be, why does this emerge from 18th century history and culture? Because you see, the 1805 publication of Grenville's work is posthumous. It was written earlier, 1790s. The predictable answers for that question are probably good enough. The Enlightenment, with its epistemologies and pioneering, accelerating technoscientificity, prompted not only awareness of humanity's new potentials, but also of its new vulnerabilities and of various precarities conditioning all forms of advancement and progress. One need only mention Thomas Malthus' 1798 essay, an essay on the principle of population, to lend that point edge. Historical upheaval, a human constant, was more than ordinarily reordering at the time. The French Revolution is, of course, impossible to overlook. For Grenville himself, who in contemporary accounts is described as hesitant and diffident, and who would later take his own life by drowning, it would spell tumult in his sensibility and thought, and prompt the giving up of the priesthood. There is then the cultural momentum that arises around a broader imaginary. It is hard, for instance, to read anything around Grenville without encountering a reference to the influence of Constantin Francois Volney's 1791 essay, The Ruins, or a survey of revolutions of empires, or to come across reference to earlier narratives that, if not quite centered on the last man trope, represent the first forays into tales of plausible or fantastical futures. I.F. Clarke himself mentions the first futuristic utopia in English, George Madden's 1763 work, The Reign of George VI. He also mentions Charles Mercier's 1771 novel, The Year 2440, as well as the research of Pierre Versan in Encyclopédie de l'Utopie des Voyages Extraordinaires de Science-Fiction to which could be added, for instance, Paul Elkin's Origins of Futuristic Fiction. In this respect, Graham V is of his time. How then would he also be seen as ahead of his time through his writing of The Last Man? Paley has noted in a comment quoted also to good effect by Amy Ransom that, quote, by 1826 the subject of The Last Man had come to seem not apocalyptic but ridiculous, unquote. This as a result of the contemporary vogue for the topic. As Charles Nodier, author of Trilby and the Infernalia, noted in his 1811 preface to the second edition of the tale, quote, not a single reviewer, not a single man of letters deigned to advocate The Last Man in the face of public indifference. The work met with only public apathy, unquote. Nodier is a fine champion for Graham V. Nodier it is who provides the first articulation of the originality and significance of The Last Man. The following lines are quoted because they put those qualities in view and also because they provide in the process the bare bones of a synopsis to the narrative. How would you regard the man who, after so many centuries of poetry, which has created such a profusion of marvels, found himself seized by an idea never before expressed, an idea that poetry had not anticipated? What would you say to a noble and sublime vision that would juxtapose the glorious days of the earth in its youth, as Milton described it, with the decadence and sickness of a dying world, the ill-fated loves of her last descendants with the delights of earthly paradise, and the end of all things with their beginning? What would you think if the poet had the skill, by a means as simple as it was ingenious, to present this entire epic saga as an account given by the last man to the father of the human race? I believe that this invention alone ranks it among the finest examples of epic inspiration. And what is this amazing tale of the And what if this amazing tale of the imagination were to be articulated in the most natural and interesting manner within a fantasy genre that was hitherto unknown? Finally, what would you say if, in this rough draft, not intended for publication, the reader were to find on almost every page the most well-crafted phrases, the most brilliant similes, the most remarkable descriptions? If so, you would still have no more than a feeble impression of the work of Monsieur de Grévy. The emphasis in the quotation are inserted in counter-acknowledgement of the distinction of the last man. It is, as Nodier notes, an unfinished work, a magnificent first draft, the first volume of a work that was to be longer. It has a number of parts, quote, somewhat inferior to the others, as well as some unsuitable passages, some dull episodes, some weak writing, and overblown phrases, unquote. All this is fairly said. Yet if the work is often overwrought, as it is because of the cycles of vulnerabilities and crises in extremis, more totalizing, more final and exterminating that it dramatizes, and the lamentations and tonalities they provoke. Graham V's art and rhetoric of an all-engulfing terminality is not configured in the minimalist key of, say, Cormac McCarthy's The Road. In his writing of The Disaster, the decorum Graham V adheres to is one in which pitiableness, loss, grief are to be pitched to a matched heightening. The end, absolute vulnerability, absolute crisis, could not take less. Aspects of that representation will be demonstrated soon, but first some account of the narrative will be given. What follows is selective, aiming not for comprehensive synopsis, but stopping rather on moments and elements conducive to shedding light on the present theme of vulnerability. The rationale for this is to observe in Granville's text the first representations in the Western imaginary of human precarity meeting the completion of human finitude, set against the deeper canvas of earthly annihilation and the coming of the Last Judgment. As might be expected given the author's personal and cultural background, The Last Man bears a distinctly Christian, not to say Catholic vision. More than once the strain is towards theodicy. But to start at the beginning and also give a sense of the plan of the work, The Last Man opens, quote, near the ruins of Palmyra and the unnamed narrator's entry into, quote, a solitary cavern that is greatly feared by the Syrians and held to be the cavern of death, unquote. He is bid enter the cavern by, quote, a man bearing a torch with a majestic brow of profound tranquility and an air of being at peace with himself. Reassured, the narrator enters and experiences, quote, complete repose, a pleasure unknown to human beings. The narrator is accorded vision and visionariness. Quote, the darkness which shrouded me rolled away. A pure light illuminated the scene, and I saw the objects which surrounded me. What he sees is a chained and powerful old man who reveals himself, quote, as the celestial spirit and later as the spirit of futurity itself, to whom all coming things are as if they had already happened. All coming things are as if they had already happened. That's a quote. And here then is the first announcement of the last man trope, of the human proceeded past all vulnerability and cast into crisis in extremis. The first instance, as far as we know, in Western literature of the figure of the last man. I wished to lift for you the veil which hides from mortal men the darkness of futurity, and I wish to make you a witness of the scene which will bring the world to a close. In those enchanted mirrors which surround you, the last man will appear before your eyes. And to spell things out, the spirit adds, finding it not tautological to do so, that, quote, the last man will have no descendants who can know and admire him. Crucially, the spirit adds, quote, my desire is that before he is born, he will be known in memory. I wish to reveal the history, so well worth the telling. Here, in echo of the opening of this chapter, is that curious temporality, that curious timescape, by which the crisis of the end can be known to human perceiving, in anticipation and revelation, in disclosure of the vulnerability to it. And interestingly, what the narrator is afforded is first the sight of a woman who, quote, advanced slowly. The narrator records that, quote, from the divine grace and charm of her figure, I could scarcely believe she was mortal, until I perceived from the sadness of her looks that she was unhappy. A young man walked by her side with downcast eyes, and like her, seemed to be deeply unhappy, unquote. These are respectively Sideria and Omegarus, the last inhabitants of earth, those whom your words must celebrate, the narrator is told by the celestial spirit. Overcome, the narrator asks if misfortune, quote, must dog the steps of man from age to age, even to their last descendants, whereupon he is accorded a different vision of a different venerable old man, whom he will recognize as Adam, the father of mankind, whose faith is in expiation, quote, of a sin he had committed, to watch sinners entering the infernal regions for eternity, yearning for deliverance, but without strength to desire it. The originality of Grenville's conception, as Nodier noted, is that the work will bring the last man to relate his predicament to the first, while the first man, Adam, must deliver to Amagarus a task and a mission that is, quote, the most painful sacrifice that the human heart can make, unquote. It will involve renunciation of Sidereal and hence the tumble into last man situatedness, as the earth, apostrophized by Adam in this section with the words, "You are a wasteland," experiences more complete destruction. Here then are vulnerability and crisis writ large across a vision of human history. This side of final crisis, the continuity of existence, is itself of its nature vulnerability in extremis. Quote, "We fear to go on living lest our woes should increase," Amagarus explains in austerely pointed depiction of that state. But here, meanwhile, in the vision accorded to the narrator, Amagarus will next tell Adam the tale of how he would receive the revelation that he would be the last man. I was still just about finishing the conclusion. Can I go on? Can I refer
Yes,
to it?
please do. Please do.
Yes, okay. So, yeah, let me just go to the start of the conclusion. So if Grenville's The Last Man has any value as a prop to thinking through the interrelation between vulnerability and crisis, it is because in providing an inaugural vision of absolute reversible, unappealable examples of each, figured in the key of apocalypse and post-apocalypse, it becomes precisely a defining allegory for their patternings. It is hard for the human to conceive a worse vulnerability than the precarity of the world and the human itself in toto. It is hard to conceive a worse crisis than that precarity turning into actuality. Grenville's The Last Man is a representation of that worst, and it is striking that it is often starker than many narratives with the same theme that follow in its wake. It is here that Derrida's work offers a basis for reflection on the further import for a thinking of vulnerability and crisis of what had been witnessed in Grenville. The introduction referred to autoimmune conditions and to logics of deterrence between superpowers always on the brink of conflict. In an interview with Giovanna Boradori from 20 years ago now, Derrida reflected on the nature of autoimmunity in both the more than 20 years ago, on the nature of autoimmunity in both the medical sense and also in the context of an extended discussion of the 9/11 attacks, of the 9/11 attacks, in reference to violence that comes, quote, as from the inside. What follows, among other observations, is a series of remarks on human apprehending of, quote, the worse and the worst. In other words, if one wished to put it differently, the phenomenology of vulnerability and crisis in the character of cascading deterioration. Hence, eventualities, quote, worse than the Cold War slide into frame, with the specter of what is worse than anything that has ever taken place, unquote. Hyper-awareness of the vulnerability to a trauma that is, quote, the impresentable to come, unquote, is experienced as a crisis before the crisis. This is contemporary familiar reality. Yet the course of history suggests that in Derrida's words, there has been worse since, and that there will be again. Traumatism, writes Derrida, is produced by the future, by the to come, by the threat of the worst to come, rather by an aggression that is over and done with. Unquote. Vulnerability crises are therefore recurrent, keyed ever higher in terms of stakes and the unthinkability of the worst, engendering themselves in cycles of mutual regendering that, as Amagoras, the last man, discovers, can perpetuate reinvention of the worse in gradualist and then abrupt and final encounter with the worst. No apparitions or visions of spirits of earth or futurity are needed to get the message, which is clear and eloquent enough already. It still remains noteworthy, though, that Graham V sounded it when and as he did, to the generations who are since inured to thinking of themselves as last men. He retoned, lastingly, all the literature of vulnerability, all the literature of crisis. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Callus.
Atul, are you there?
Yes, sir. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure. Thank you so much, Professor Callus, for that most fascinating talk. I mean, it was unfortunate that we lost you in between due to technical reasons, but then it was great that you could be back. And hopefully you would take questions from the audience.
Yes, of course, yes.
Yes, sure. Sure. The floor is open to questions. You could raise your hand or type it in the chat box. Yes, Roy, please go ahead. Yes.
So thank you, Professor Callus, for the enlightening presentation. I had a question. I had two questions. One is about the a subtle reference to the extraterrestrial in the book, in Granby's novel. Now, there's a mention of a star that rejuvenates suns. So I was wondering if such, if that could subvert the humanist idea of a universe revolving around Earth. My second question was about, the vision of Forstan. I mean, the father. There's a vision of fake vision of the father of the female protagonist, and that vision convinces Omegarus and Sideria to have a child, and that vision is actually a trick of the spirit of the earth. So the spirit of the earth is trying to encourage humanity to remain on the earth. So there, when earth itself wants humanity to remain, I was wondering if that goes against the post-humanist ideal, where the humanity is not the prime concern of the earth. Those were my questions.
Yes. Two good questions, two really good prompts. You are of course right that there is the reference to the rejuvenating star, and I think, one of the, as I see it, one of the really intriguing aspects of Graham V's text is that the end keeps getting deferred, and a lot of the narrative depends on strategies of the feral, not only in the act of narration. There are, of course, and there's more than one embedded, there are so many embedded narratives in the text. But there is also the sense that because there are so many contending prophecies on how the world will end by more than one seemingly trustworthy seer, Idamas, Ormus, Polyctetes, towards the end, Thybes, and so on. One always gets the sense that Amagoras, the last man may yet be reprieved. And therefore, it's possible to think of that rejuvenated star and the ferrule of destruction and indeed renewal of Earth and broader existence as symbolic of the same possibility of reprieve. But then I think, you know, your question about Forestan is I think really important, because it's really emblematic of how those contending prophecies encounter contestation with each other. And as you say, it's all a result of the deception perpetrated by the spirit of Earth. You know, this is its way of keeping itself going. There is, I think, I'm a little bit hesitant to say that in the end, in Graham V's text, there is a sense that the Earth, so to speak, exceeds the human, because I think there is a powerful anthropocentric tendency to the text. So Graham V is probably ahead of his time in suggesting that there are, you know, that all of this is readable in terms of what we would think of as eco-critical perceptions. But I think the tendency in the text ultimately remains anthropocentric.
Thank you, sir.
Anusha Hegde has a question in the chat box. Would you mind reading it out, Anusha?
Thank you, sir. Good after. I don't know what time it is over there, but greetings to you. So my question is with regard to the when you were talking about the post-apocalyptic world and you were defining how a human being in the world in which a human being is living. In this correlation, the way in which they try to understand the precarity of their condition, I wanted to bring it in light with the different ways in which a human is being conceptualized in that specific time and context. Like a human in terms of species, the human vulnerability as a species, or what a human being defines himself or herself or themselves in terms of the cultural understanding of what a human is. And when you extrapolate it to the post-human condition of the technologies of the body and the discourses which come forward, when you look at it in the gradation with which the human as a being and as a thought, it gets aggregated and it gets extrapolated to different levels and scopes. What I wanted to understand was, can we say that in the post-human discourse and the imagination of the post-human condition, can we say that the universe in which the human being locates herself or himself or themselves in, from where they derive the meaning of human, that itself is vulnerable to different meanings and interpretations. So because of which we get a difficulty in defining exactly where human vulnerability is located in the post-human condition. That was my thought.
Yes. Okay, so I hope, I mean, that's I think a very expansive and potentially very consequential question, because it opens onto what might be thought of as genealogies of how we come to understand the human condition and indeed the post-human condition. And you will recall that one of the sections in my talk was titled Of Its Time, and then in parentheses, alternatively, ahead of its time. And I think here we are witnessing, here we are observing, we're attempting to closely read a text that is possibly approachable as an example of a proto-post-humanist sensibility, or at least a proto-post-humanist affinity in perceiving things related to the Anthropocene, the relation between humanity and the non-human, conceptions of the earth without humanity, matter, all of those things. And I think it's quite possible to approach Grenfell's The Last Man as a text that in one way cannot really distance itself from ideas and beliefs that in some ways Grenfell, even as a former Catholic priest, would have probably felt to be irrepressible. And yet the text is shot through with moments in which, as you read, you almost gasp because it feels so incredibly contemporary to us. It feels, you almost say this is, this can sound glib, but you almost feel like this surely is ahead of its time. Now, of course, we need to be careful in making those statements because we can sometimes be too quick in saying this was an 18th century way of thinking, this was an Enlightenment way of thinking, and this is in what we would consider a revised way of seeing things. But as I read The Last Man, as I was rereading it for the purposes of this paper, I was again struck, as I always tend to be when looking at it, by moments where you realize that there is a world picture starting to unsettle itself, starting to disturb itself. And I think one of those moments occurs. There are various moments in the text where, for example, Adam or Ormus or Megaris himself suggests that the disposition of a divinity, the disposition of God, should not be questioned. But then towards the end, there are various moments in which God is pictured relenting at the sight of the distress of Siberia, and there are various ways in which all of that is not strictly theologically orthodox. So there are little moments like that, more than one, where you can see a world picture, I think. One world picture shifting and another one possibly about to start emerging. And therefore, I think Grenfell's The Last Man has foresight, has some level of proto-post-humanist power, not only because it engenders this influential trope of the last man, which is so ubiquitous in popular culture and broader culture now, in the imaginary. But I think also, as your question in fact suggests and underlines, that there is a post-humanist, a sense of post-humanist bearings coming into play.
Thank you, sir.
If there are any more questions, you could raise your hand or type it in the chat box. Professor Callus, I had a question, if you wouldn't mind.
Yes.
You mentioned that Granby's text was, though it was published posthumously in the early 19th century and was most probably written in the 1790s, which is the end of the 18th century. In the beginning of that century, in 1719, you had Robinson Crusoe, which in many ways is a pioneer text in the sense that it represents Crusoe as being a pioneer in that island and someone who molds that island in his own image because according to his own wishes, etc. And shortly after the publication of Granby's text, we have Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, another text which questions the limits of the human of the human being itself. My question is, can we draw an arc of the vulnerability of the human subject from, say, Robinson Crusoe till Granby or till Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, from a pioneer narrative like Robinson Crusoe till a post-apocalyptic narrative like Granby's text?
Yes, there is I think, there is certainly, I'm trying to choose my words carefully because there is certainly a line that we can see, and the texts you mentioned are very discernibly on a continuum that we would say is starting to develop what I referred to earlier as this proto-post-humanist line, this engendering of a post-humanist sensibility through these literary texts, through these fictions, through these speculative fictions in many ways. And there has been a good there has been a lot of significant historical scholarship done, certainly in the work of figures like Morton Paley, in tracing aspects of that line. And what I'm uncertain about, and what you see me hesitating over, is there detectable influence, or is it a case of what, to use a very neutral and non-committal word, becomes a tendency, a trend, a discernible mode in the imaginary. I think the critic I mentioned earlier, who comments on the way in which the trope of the last man, for example, becomes so regular as to become, the word used was ridiculous. And it's interesting, incidentally, and a point of comparison, that we don't think of our equivalent to that regularity of that trope as being ridiculous in the same way. We don't think it's out of place. We don't think it's incongruous. We keep coming up with these narratives, and therefore it's, I think your instinct is right. I think it's important to look at what exactly it is that is born with the set of texts that stretch from Defoe, Crusoe to Mary Shelley. There's Byron's poem, of course, Darkness. There are the texts indicated by I.F. Clarke and M. Clarke in their introduction, the texts by Charles Mercier and Madden. So we could find ample evidence of this kind of literature being born, of this kind of these kinds of engenderings of speculative fiction and science fiction. And it's interesting that it tends to occur across the long 18th century. So, yeah, I think your instinct is certainly right. I have to confess to being a bit unsure about the detectability of influence. But I'm not a literary historian either, so I'm vulnerable there, talking of vulnerability.
Thank you so much. Yes, thank you so much, Professor Callus. Surya has a question. Please go ahead, Surya.
Hello, sir. Hello.
Hello. Hello.
Yes, Surya, we can hear you. Please go ahead.
Having humans and animals, irrespective of anything, is maybe the idea of vulnerability or finitude or mortality, which could be sensed in some varying in degrees of intensities. So I really want to know to what extent maybe the concept of animality hinders human subjectivity, or how this animality, when imposed on humans, affects human orientations itself. Sir.
Yeah, I'm not sure I understood the first part of the question because the connection wasn't good there. But if I got the second part right, the question is about animality and how this can be read in the context of what I discussed concerning Grenville. Now, yeah, I think my response to that is that I'm thrust back in a sense towards the fact, well, Grenville's The Last Man is the kind of text it is, right? It is not, I think, a text that we would think of as secular or very materialist, and it has a character that, in a sense, puts in the foreground its interest in spirituality and the spirituality of the human. And therefore, my response to your question is that I think this particular text, perhaps not others that we could mention where the trope of the last man comes in, but in this particular text, the animality in terms of the nature of the human is not as perceivable, is not perceivable to the same degree that there is the witnessing and upholding of the propensity towards the spiritual in the human. So that is the first thing I would say. The second thing I would say, though, is that, and this might seem, again, almost glib and facile or simplistic, the animality at the heart of The Last Man is never more in evidence than in the growing realization that this is ultimately a story, a narrative about a death of the totality of the human that cannot eventually be averted So to connect also to a question that was asked earlier, there are many moments in the text where we think that the end is going to be averted, or at least repeatedly deferred, and it doesn't happen, and we realize that it doesn't happen, that it won't happen, because ultimately one of the principal characteristics of animality, the simple fact that of mortality and death and wasting away, and there are various descriptions in the text to wasting away and emaciation and weakness and so on. All of that is there, but it's always played back by Grimvey against representations as he sees it of the spiritual within the human.
Atul?
Hi.
Yeah. Professor Callus, shall we wind up? I think.
Yeah, it's up to you. Yeah.
Is Atul there?
Sure.
Atul, yes.
Can you hear me? Yes, can you hear me? Yes.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah. Yeah, no, on behalf of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, may I thank Professor Ivan Callus for accepting our invitation and for delivering the talk today. Thank you so much, Professor Callus, for this most fascinating talk and for drawing light on a text that you mentioned is often overlooked and probably not theorized as much as it should have been. And thank you so much for bringing it to our attention. And I'm sure a lot of us would go back and look the text up and read it. So thank you so much. Thank you to everybody in the audience. Thank you for joining us. And the video of this talk will be available on the website of the UNESCO Chair in Vulnerability Studies, as well as on our YouTube channel shortly. So do look forward to it. And we hope to keep you informed on the upcoming talks and sessions as part of the series. Thank you, as always, to Professor Pramod Kirnair, the UNESCO Chair, and Professor Anna Kurian, the Faculty Fellow of the UNESCO Chair. So thank you so much. Thank you, everyone, once again. Thank you, Professor Callus, once again.
Thank you. Thank you for hosting me virtually, and thank you for all your questions and all your attention. Thanks very much. Thanks for having me.
Thank you, everyone, for the very patient responses. Yeah. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks. Bye.